the Pinelands Methodist. It's my first time ever. So it's good to be in the church and in this community setting. So my name is Natalie, and I'm a research psychologist and registered counselor and trauma disruptor. Grant and I work for R-Cube, and should I go ahead and say what R-Cube is? So we work like that. So we work in different sectors in society, and we try and disrupt that cycle of trauma. We work in government, we work with schools, we work with communities. Some of the communities we currently work in, tomorrow we're both in Langa. So we're working in Langa, we're working in Kensington, we all over the city doing different things. Yeah, so that's just a little bit about me.
Yeah.
So Grant?
So Grant Stewart is the name. I actually grew up virtually a stone's throw from the church, on Forest Drive there, just above the BP, around the bend. So my parents still live here in Pinelands. So Pine News, they still live there. So I was studying Ross and Lauren, and earlier that one of my, I have a very early memory of Pinelands Methodist. I didn't spend a lot of time here because, sorry, I apologize, I was brought up Baptist. Just forgive me, it's right, you know. But when we moved here when I was 12, and I went to the Blue School, but a lot of my sort of fellow classmates, they used to come to the guild, I think it was called the Youth Guild at the time, and so they dragged me along. So I used to hang here, especially during my standard 5 year, I was here. So it's a bit of an old, you know, coming back to the old bit. You know, I still remember when the spa was called the Beehive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We still call it that.
Oh, yeah. For some, never go away. So, all right, so that's me, and she said about R-Cube. We're open to questions also about during the evening, and about what we do. Happy to engage on that, and we hopefully we really want your participation in this, because as much as Ross says, we're the experts. In many ways, all of us carry knowledge about things, and so it's about bringing that knowledge out and talking about it and putting it out there, and sometimes putting the knowledge into a framework that helps us to then understand. Like the heading is how we then deal with the headlines of looting and shooting, and actually to go beyond that and say let's go into the matrix. And just an aside, the reason I used the title, there's one other reason that the title there, but part of it is because I am a Matrix fan. And Matrix 4 is coming out later this year. After almost 20 years since the third one. I didn't like Matrix 2 and 3. I thought they were pretty badly done, so I'm very hoping there'll be some redemption with Matrix 4. But we'll talk about that when after it's come out. So, all right.
Thank you so much. I would like for us to be in an engaging space. So if you have a question or thought, or comment at any point in time, please just raise your hand, raise your voice. We're not going to feel any kind of way. We want that. Okay, so to get us started, as R-Cube, we often do just a bit of a lighting setup. No, it's not a setup. It's just a lighting of candles, and we try and bring each candle into perspective for us. So the first candle that I'm going to light tonight, I want us to take a minute to think about your community. Think about your environmental community. Think about Pinelands, your family, where you find yourself. I also want you to think about South African communities. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a minute to think about community. going to invite you, as I light the second candle, to think about yourself. So we're going to bring it from the outside context. And I want you to think about yourself and think about your position within your community, or your workplace, or your family, in context. How do you feel about your position? Are you positioned in your way? Okay? So this will give you a minute to think about yourself. Alright, so I'm going to invite you back into the bigger space, and as we progress through this evening, which is going to be very interactive, we're trying to not just keep it a one-way presentation. I want you to, every time you glance over at the candles, I want you to think of community and yourself within that community. It could even be your church community. Okay, I want you to think of community, and I want you to remember or be mindful of yourself within that community, because we're going to be reflecting on that quite a bit throughout the next few minutes. So I'm going to hand over to Grant, and we're going to move on to a connecting activity.
Right. So, can you just Natalie, help me out?
No problem.
Just take one of those and pass on. You're not allowed to eat it. So you've got a number of items there. And keep this in mind. What I want to do as a connecting activity with one another is just you're going to share one thing with one or two people around you. Right? If you have the ear in your hand, right, I want you to share something that you like to, a sound that you like, whether it's a sound like piece of music or the sound of nature, whatever it is, tell people that. If it's the nose, it's something, maybe it's it could be your favorite perfume, smell, something around that, right? If it's the teeth, just, it's not dentures, just swap the tongue for that, but something that you like to taste, like something that you love, or alternatively, it's words that you live by. Right, you still with me? Okay, then the brain is talk about something that's a dream of yours or something that you enjoy thinking about, right? And then, what else? Oh yes, there's a hand. What are things that you like to do? What's your something that you're passionate about? And then the feet. Where is it that you like to go, or where is it you would like to go? All right. Yeah, you all with me? So just take a moment, just 2 or 3 people around you, and just share with one another. If you're not too close to somebody else, you don't get too close to them. But maybe if you want to turn with 1 or 2 others, just to share that, just in a couple of minutes, let each other know about what you. All right. So. The important thing, so today's one, our kind of session really, so we're doing it over 2 parts, and today's really kind of, let's establish the kind of picture of how things, when things are happening. So we all know about all the headlines from, say, July, the looting and the shooting and this and that, people loading big televisions onto the back of the car, trolleys. In fact, I was in Addo during July, and I was on my way back, driving on the edge in a car, the bucket comes flying past with lots of stuff, including a big screen TV on the back, and I'm thinking, I wonder if they were visiting Natal. It's just a thought. But yeah, so we know all the headlines. What we want to kind of go is like, the headlines can be misleading and sometimes don't help us to understand actually what's happening or what's going on, and how best we can then respond to it. And so this week's really kind of, let's create a little framework for that, and then 2 weeks' time is going to go a little dig a little bit more around what happens in the individual. And we're going to look at it in 2 weeks, we'll look at it in 2 parts. One is the individual who might get up to violence, because we know we're a society that struggles with a lot of violence. But also, we need to look at it in terms of us, in our response to what we're hearing. And actually, we need to know that there's 2 parts to that. All right? Okay, so that's the basic map of it. So to start with, if you just flick the switch on the... right, can you see that picture? Kind of. I want you to tell me, so there's, if you can't see, there's a man in the front, they're sitting at a dinner table. There's a woman on the other side, she's looking down. There you go. What is helpful table?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Can you tell me what's going on there? Have a look and tell me.
Reflection.
A reflection.
Not communicating.
They're not communicating. All right. So, what else? What else do you think's going on?
I think by the hand on the table, he's been telling her something that she doesn't like to hear.
Ah, yes. Okay.
She got a cell phone in there. Distracted.
No, I think she's actually got her bag. She's got her bag.
Ready to run.
Yeah, maybe she's ready to run. Yeah. Sorry? He's talking and she's listening? Okay.
She doesn't agree with what he wants to say or what he's saying.
Yeah.
She's looking up.
Okay, so she's not agreeing.
There's no eye
Was
contact.
blushing.
No eye contact. What's the other one?
Blushing, but I don't know.
Blushing. Maybe he's saying something sweet and she can't take it. He's getting all romantic and she's like, oh. Anything else? So, yes.
I was thinking his hand on the table would say to me that he's got something important to speak about.
Okay. So it could be just something important. Are they, but is it, are they having a fight? Are they, or is it just a serious conversation? Maybe it's about the chick who's paying.
The hand on the table to me speaks of controlling.
Okay, so
I'm the boss.
I'm the boss. Okay, I know the control things. Okay. Last thing.
There's flowers.
There are flowers. Yes, there's a flower.
A plant would be a flower.
Speaks to maybe a romantic dinner.
Yeah.
Gone wrong. Anything else? Last few seconds. Alright, so we can look at something and make lots of judgments about what we see. Right. But then if I tell you, have any of you ever seen, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Sixth Sense? Any of you ever saw the movie Sixth Sense? Right? If any of you are going to watch it, I'm sorry, but there's a spoiler alert coming up. It is an old movie, so if you didn't know, it's too late now. But in the movie, those two were married, but he gets killed.
Ooh.
He doesn't know he's dead. And he thinks he's still alive. And so the whole movie plays out, and that you only learn right at the end of the movie that actually he's dead. But he hasn't been able to accept it and process it. So in the movie, so she's grieving. I can't remember if this was their anniversary dinner, but she's grieving. She's having dinner. This is one of the anniversary moments. And it looks like he's trying to talk to her, but she's not listening to him. But that's because he's not there in her understanding, even though he's there for himself. And so that's the craziness of when we see something and we make judgments without knowing the context of the story. We can actually make all kinds of judgments about what we see, whether it's good or bad, but that could be entirely off base. Right. And maybe we've got a few things right. He was maybe trying to, I can't even remember now, if he was trying to be firm, but she just never looks at him at any point. And it's only when you're at the end of the movie and they play it back and you go, ah. This is the worst movie for spoiler because it destroys the entire movie. So, if you go to the next slide, please, Lauren. So, this is a little quote that has sat with me for 20 odd years, but I'll read it. A phenomenon remains unexplainable as long as the range of observation is not wide enough to include the context in which the phenomenon occurs. Failure to realize the intricacies of the relationship between an event or a series of events and the matrix in which it takes place either confronts the observer with something mysterious or induces them to attribute to their object of study certain properties the object may not possess. We look at something, and so that's why I use a little picture by artists around the elephant. Right? If you only see a portion of the elephant, you decide what it is that you see. Even though that's not the whole picture. So this is the important thing about understanding context. One of the interesting things with this, the book that this comes from, they explain a story of an ethologist who used to work with ducklings. He used to help ducklings become ducks. Right? This was years ago. So it talks about a story of there were a group of people doing something, I can't remember, they were tourists, and this ethologist comes out the bush, quack, kind of flapping his wings, so to speak, doing a quacking sound. So to the group of people, tourists, they look at this guy and think, guy's lost his marbles, right? If they stayed long enough, maybe they would have seen the ducklings come out the bush following him. And then maybe it would have clicked. So again, it's saying we need to understand the whole matrix, the whole environment, so that we can understand what we're seeing. All right. So what I want us to do is a little bit of, you're gonna help me populate something on the whiteboard. Well, you don't have to come up and do it. You can just shout. Right. Let me just do this. And then we're gonna have. I'm left-handed, I'm clever. That's
Is it darker color? No.
oh yeah.
Is there a dog colour?
I will now. I'm just drawing a picture right now. I hope there's colours. All right, so we're going to populate this, and this basically is like what they call a map of the social ecology of an individual. So an individual exists within a context, and the context is made up a whole lot of intricate, interacting, entangled things, right? That person interacts with, from the institutions they are a part of, their families, the society, the culture, the ideas, and the medias, and whatever else, all right? This makes up. So, I want us to think about, just to start with, let's think about someone who lives in Pinelands, right? What is the history that individual lives in the context, the history of Pinelands? Just some thoughts around what was the history that is relevant to not just Pinelands, but the place in Pinelands is. It's in Cape Town and it's in South Africa. So what history has relevance here? Any thoughts?
Began with a local board, became a municipality.
Okay, so there was a municipality, a local board. So that's part of the history of Pinelands. So there once was a local board. We don't have to go into the history of Pinelands too much as establish the context in which Pinelands was birthed.
White middle class population.
Okay, white middle class population is the history of it. Right, there's also another hand.
Wasn't it started after the war to provide housing for those who were coming back?
World War I or World War II?
Two, I would say. I'm not
Yeah,
Yes, it was.
yeah,
Well, both.
there might have been part of that. So
Returning Saturday.
World War II.
Cape Town's first garden city.
There you go.
Ah, that's important.
No,
Okay. What other history exists here within the
Sense of community.
there was a
when it was a municipality, it had its own council, its own mayor,
That's own mayor. Okay.
very much part of this church. Anyway.
Anything else? What about
Pine trees.
pine trees?
Squirrel.
And pine cones, is that the other name? Squirrels.
There we go. Pine trees, squirrels,
Nuts.
canal, school. Anything else of history that's of significance to Pinelands?
Couldn't build more than a double-story house.
Oh dear. Yeah.
In the flats came.
So limit to buildings. So my wife is she works for Heritage Department in the city of Cape Town. So
And what's the most significant thing that has been here for donkey's years? Or that hasn't been here? A pub.
a pub. Of course, yeah, you couldn't. No, alcohol's not allowed here.
No alcohol.
Still a dry.
Sunrise Circle, yeah.
It's a dry suburb.
Maybe a good idea.
Although the number, well, when I was growing up, you wouldn't have thought it was a dry suburb. The young people I knew. So, well, anything else that you can think of? Last thing, third? Yes.
Blue, red, and green school.
Okay, so there are certain schools, the blue, red, BR, and green schools. Lots of churches.
Yeah, but not allowed to any church bells,
No church bells.
which
Okay.
is very strange.
Churches,
No, but you're allowed to, aren't you
but
allowed?
no church bells.
Yeah, they're not allowed to ring, I guess.
That's right, because it disturbs the squirrels. Don't mess with the squirrels in the pine trees, alright?
Give them earrings.
The first primary school had trenches,
And what?
trenches during the war.
Trenches to
In
train
case
them,
we,
in case you're invaded. Alright. There are obviously lots of other things we can think about. Growing up, what's the context of a pine, someone growing it now? But what's the history of pines? This history of the pines. Also, the other things we need to note is it was only for white people for a long, long period of time. Right? So that needs to be in the thing. There was it existed in the context of apartheid. I remember during my high school years, during the state of emergency, the one year they told us we must lock all the corridor doors just in case the protesters from London came to invade the school. Yes, Lauren, I don't know if you remember, but we weren't allowed out on the playground for our own safety. So there's the context of a place that has a history, right? And people growing up, sometimes we don't know the history. But what is the history that informs the way a suburb grows and the people in it? But it's also a place that seems to be, although it has its intricacies and it has its weirdness, I suppose, its eccentricities, it is also a place that's quite peaceful, it's quiet. Some people would say growing up in Pines it was too quiet.
people of caution.
Sorry? It was nothing was open after 10 o'clock in the evening. Once the spur had closed, that was it. It was over. And so that's things have changed obviously since then. Things have evolved. So the Pinelands and the individual now growing up in Pinelands, they don't necessarily see all this, but this is present in the way things are formed and structured. It makes still that perhaps makes up the dominant demographic of the community. Is influenced by this past, right? So we can look at that. I mean, the other thing that we could talk about, that we're throwing here, is Indabeni, which is right alongside, and the people that were forcibly removed from the harbour to Indabeni and then to Langa back in the 1920s. Right, so that's part of Pinelands too, but it's not part of the Pinelands that necessarily people talk about. And how does that influence how we think about Pinelands today? But let's say, what is everyday life like in Pinelands? So the EA is everyday life. We've got homes, we've got nice houses, right? Right, so nice, so there's generally houses, good houses.
Lots of traffic.
Lots of traffic. Pinelands have traffic.
Through traffic.
Road traffic, yeah.
It can be worse.
Traffic.
From the
But it's only on Forest Drive, isn't it?
And Ringwood Drive.
And Ringwood Drive.
Yep.
Yes.
And Union Avenue.
Yeah, all the rapper. It's all Old Mutual's fault, I tell you. Old Mutual, that's what we should put, yeah.
Yeah.
We complain a lot here.
Do you complain about yeah?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so let's put it up here. Complain.
Everyone.
Alright, you complain a lot. What do we complain about?
Everything.
Okay.
We complain about Pick and Pay.
Why didn't they stock enough stuff for? Hey? Or they stocked the wrong stuff?
Yep.
Okay, so Pick and Pay is a problem.
I don't know the kind of words
Pick and Pay is a real issue.
We even complain too much about the traffic. I came from living in Main Road Observatory, and you know the difference.
Yes, I know the difference.
Pure peacefulness and quiet.
Yeah, I grew up in Forest Drive, so the only thing I ever heard was traffic noise. And what else? Everyday life. What's it like? So what do individuals interact with every day? What might happen? They might go to school. Right?
School and
Somebody don't go to school anymore, I presume.
School and work and housework.
School, work, housework,
Sport.
And go to the shops.
shops,
Coffee shop.
coffee, right?
Visiting.
Shops, visiting friends, sport, as you say.
Walking, community walking.
Yeah, lots of walking,
Running.
hanging by the river,
Canal.
the canal.
Exercising your animals.
Yeah, dog walking, also see that with the walking part. Right, so that's your everyday. That's, homes, and I suppose a large proportion of those homes are generally nuclear families. A lot of them, but not all of them, there'll be two parents in the home. Would that be fair to say as a general thing, although that's not? That's also, there's probably lots of single parents
Yeah.
as well. But that's generally a thing. So there's kids who go to school, then they eventually go to university. And what do they say? You get born in Principality, you go to school, you go to the red school, the blue school, the green school, or Cannons Creek now. And then you go to the high school, Cannons Creek High School, and then you go to university. And then maybe after university you might leave for a moment and then come back and your children get born at Vincent Pallotti and you get children. Isn't that the way it works in Pinelands? Because I know Lauren's come back to Pinelands, So I resisted it. Maybe I was never born at Vincent Pallotti, so maybe that's where it lies. But my children were born at Vincent Pallotti, how about that? So anyway, so everyday life for individual is this.
Not the elderly as well.
Yeah. So
Retirement.
Lots of retirement.
Retirement home.
yeah, so people used to tell me that Pinelands was a retirement village. So Pinelands. This is Pinelands every day. Well, apart from what's community life broader wise, there's Where do people work? They normally work.
Old Mutual.
Old Mutual, there we go. Anyone works Old Mutual?
City of Cape Town.
City of Cape Town.
They used to work a lot at the university.
Yeah, so there's.
There used to be many lecturers that lived here.
My dad's an emeritus professor. If he could, he would still be going up to the.
Observatory. You work in observatory?
What about observatory? Oh yes, working observatory. So the work just outside, come back, but most people are employed. Right, so there's lots of employment, right? So we've got employment. Generally speaking, it's quite high. So incomes are quite steady because, well, to live in Pinelands, you've got to. Houses aren't cheap here. I know, I have to go to Lakeside to find a cheap house. Couldn't come to Pinelands.
To Lavender Hill.
Sorry?
The cheapest house in Lavender Hill.
Lavender.
Oh,
Lavender Hill, sorry.
true. Anything else about the community-wise? What are your services like? What's the services like here? Do you have what's security, safety and security like?
Deteriorating.
Deteriorating. Is that what you complain about?
Yes.
Okay, you got lots of private security, right?
Refuse collection, regular.
So you got refuse collection.
Electricity.
Your toilets flush?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Mostly.
Water.
Sanitation. You got water. Potholes get fixed. Mostly.
Yes.
Subway flooded.
Anyway, so that's your services here, your police, your security, there's lots of things happen here. So I know there's crime, but generally people still feel reasonably safe, I would presume. You know there's an uptake in crime.
But
And
if things don't happen quickly enough, we complain.
yes, that's right. Well, there we go. Complaint. The place that complains. What's the time? I must try. Don't go over time here. Okay, we're all right. Right, and then the wider society. Let's talk about Pinelands in the wider. What happens? What are factors that will influence? So this individual here, growing up in Pinelands, wherever they are, whatever age they are, because you can put in different ages here, different genders, different orientations, whatever the makeup of the individual is. Okay, we'll do that next time. We'll talk about that a bit more. But they live in a place, right, in this Pinelands place, with this history, which they might not realize, but it influences what they see every day, what they experience every day. This has got a lot to do with this. And, in fact, this has a lot to do with why this works. Okay, so there's a lot of interconnections here. And the individual who has a place to go to school, the shops are nearby, the toilets work, they know they can have water, showers, sports, society equipment, whatever fields are available. And apart from Pick n Pay, the shops are pretty decent. Right? I mean, the only complaint I would have about Pinelands is, if I want a Gatsby at 1 o'clock in the morning, there's nowhere to go. I don't think Pinelands even makes Gatsby's. Do any of you know what a Gatsby is? How many of you know what a Gatsby is? Please put it there. Okay, most of the people know what a Gatsby is. Gatsby is wonderful for creating, heart attacks. It's a big fat bread roll, filled with slop chips.
Oh, yeah.
And then you can decide what meat you want. You can have bologna. You can eat bologna. You can have Venus. You can have steak or chicken. You can even have fish nowadays.
Yes.
And then you can divide. You can have masala steak. You can have peri steak. Right? You can have something. They normally sprinkle a little bit of lettuce and tomatoes just to make you feel happy. And there you got it nicely. And then you can ask them to cut it up in 3 or 4 or half. It's entirely up to you. And so that's the food. Right? I learned early in life, in my days after school. One day I was with some friends, we went to the movies. Movies came out, it was 1:30, it was like midnight, and they were like, "Hey, we're hungry. just go and get some, I don't know, where do you get diet at this time? Like, you know, I'm used to finance. Everything's closed by then. No, let's go to Golden Dish. Golden Dish is in Athlone. There was a queue, 1:45 in the morning. The gas was good. All right. It's a totally aside, but just want to let you know, gas is a great thing. So we got this, so that the person living here, the individual growing up, has the schools, has parents are generally working, services are available, there's hospitals nearby, there's GPs, lots of GPs, there's lots of churches, if you need to go to church. But what's in terms of society as of relevance? Anything?
Well, our community is close by, so Athlone, Methven, Bangala.
Okay, so you've got I've just put socioeconomic, but it's communities with a socioeconomic difference nearby, right? And I'm sure you remember, again, if we go to history, right? There was finance, there was a Jan Smuts drive a railway line in London. That was for people who were black, and then there was, is it Alexandra Road? I can't remember what's the road. That is that, all right? Railway line, that road, and then Garden Village, right? Where mostly coloured people live. I once worked with a guy in prison who was from Garden Village, and we had lots of laughs. I told him, because he got arrested because he was breaking and entering into finance houses. So we had a bit of a giggle, because I told him that you broke into my parents' place, I know. But yeah, the interesting journey of what his life and the way he saw finance from his position. Anyway, so there's the different communities that are often hidden. You don't really see them, and we don't need to see them. What else is of significance?
Quite a bit of industry around us, so FM, Ndebeni.
Yeah, so industry would mainly sit there, slightly on the community side, so you have industry nearby, again, employment nearby.
Train stations.
Sorry?
Train stations. You've got transport.
Train stations. So there's transport, but also most people here use cars. Wouldn't that be true to say? There's lots of vehicles, right?
Central.
Close to the
I
airport,
was
close
central
to town.
Yeah.
into
So there's lots of availability to things, to places of work, to airports, to transport, to highways. Even though that we complain about the traffic, because I think we have to talk and complain to the designers who made finance. We only created one way in and one way out, pretty much. It's their fault. Blame them. Right. On the bigger level, it's the economy affects finance. As effect, there's politics. What happens in a parliament is this level is ideology, right? What are the main thoughts and information that we buy into, right? There's mass media. There's now social media.
Visible poverty as well.
Right, there we go. Poverty. So I'm going to go, but I'm running out of time. So there's high levels of violence, gender-based violence across our country. Right? We've got our crime rate is quite high. Our violence rate is quite high. Like I said, our poverty is quite high. So we've got a lot of people on social welfare grants.
Unemployment.
So unemployment is very high. Right?
It's a lot of homes for the elderly. A lot of elderly people.
Yeah, so,
Provision for them.
okay, so are you saying there's a lack of?
No, there's lots of.
You mean in finance? Yeah, okay, so yeah, you got abundant accommodation for the elderly, right? We have hospitals here. And then, so at this level, we're thinking of what's the situation of our health industry, right?
corruption.
there's corruption. All right, so I'm just going to stop there. So saying there's all these things, all right, which impact the individual growing up in Pinelands, but, and this is the important thing, is we've got buffers, correct? There's these different levels of buffers that, although the economy is in many ways tanking, there's still a degree in which a lot of people are doing it right in Pinelands. They will cope with the tanking to some degree. Although I know for those living on pensions, when the interest rate goes too low, it's not so active.
It's
so
inflation that's the problem.
what's that?
Inflation is the problem.
Inflation, yeah. There's global speculators who mess with us. All right. So before I hand over to Natalie, what I'd ask you now, we need to think. We've got this year. If we had to try and say, we don't really know people that live in KwaZulu-Natal. Right, so it's hard to kind of go, well, I know what their circumstances are. But we can go, what about one of those communities nearby? If we were to say, Langa. Individuals, what is the history of Langa? Right? An individual growing up there's a history in Langa, which would be different to Pines. One of which is, Langa was established by the means of forced removals, as far back as the 20s. Right? So people from Kensington, interestingly enough, where we work as well, were moved from Kensington to Langa. Like I said, the people from Ndebeni were moved to Langa. Langa is the oldest township in the country. Right? So it's a history. It's also a history of apartheid, anti-apartheid activism. There's a strong activism that was there. So a strong sort of community-based response. Right, so there's this whole history around apartheid and the impact of apartheid and the government, and we can take this history even further back. This is very recent history. You can even go further back. All right? And what Natalie will talk about will make a little bit of sense. But then the individual growing up in the everyday, what is everyday life like in Langa? Do you know? Right? It's different to Pinelands. Some of them are good houses, but houses aren't always secure. Right? They've got very high levels of violence. They have to live with segmented neighborhood watches and safety patrols, not private citizens trying to make up for the patrol. For those in informal settlement areas, sanitation, water doesn't really happen. And so, what's the everyday life? Do they have access? What do they have access to in terms of schools and sport and housing and what was their day life like? Do they get to walk their dogs? And so I want you to kind of start to think the individual living in the history of Langa with the everyday experience. And there's lots of happy things in Langa. So it's not saying that all of Langa is terrible, right? And then there's the community stuff. What are the experiences of the police, of services from the city of Cape Town? What's the history around it? Where do they have to go and find employment? Is there employment in Langa? Or is it, and what's transport like? Do you know the trains aren't traveling through Langa at the moment? So it depends entirely on the taxi and bus services. Limited schooling, and obviously if they go to other places in schooling, again that becomes transport, maybe overcrowded houses. So if you put all of that into this context, right, a change that we start to think, okay, what's different? And how do we then start to think about when we look at the looting and the shooting, say in Natal, right? And complex thing with no simplistic things, but if you think, you like to say, you complain about Pick n Pay, complain about the traffic, right? If your dignity is forever undermined because you don't have proper sanitation houses and that kind of stuff. How do you live with that? And then when you see what's happening at this level, what's happening in corruption in government and stuff like that. If you just go to the next slide, Lauren. It's frozen. So while we get it up, one of the things that we think about when we think about what happened in the looting and shootings, we think about violence. We think about they were violent, those people were violent, they did violent things. And part of the challenge is in when we have to rethink, if we're going to understand that and the violence in our society, we need to understand things differently about what is violence. And we understand one, that the violence is not in context. One author said violence is the context. But we need a slightly broader definition of what we mean by violence. And what I hope it comes up at some point.
I'm sorry, I'm struggling.
That's all right. Is it the computer or is it?
Might be the operation.
Okay. Well,
Lauren, close it down and start it again.
yeah, please don't make sure. I know that you get paid for this thing. Hey, so. But basically, the quote, the definition of violence that this one person uses, and which I like to use, is that it's the illegitimate limitation. I'm trying to remember. Is it limitation?
Agency.
Yeah. The illegitimate limitation of agency. Right. And agency, what I mean by agency is my capacity to make choices for my life. Right? The person behind this individual here, has lots of choices. Correct? About their life. Their choices are broad. We move to areas when you move into more poverty and maybe longer and beyond. When there's an illegitimate limitation, when structures and systems are reducing somebody's capacity to actually make choices for their life. Right? When their ability to make choices is radically reduced, we need to understand that as a form of violence. And only when we understand that, right?
Sorry.
That's fine. So it's a relationship with which at least one of the parties experiences an illegitimate limitation of their agency, right? Which could be a group, an individual. But I want us to hold that in mind when, that is going to come to the next last bit here, is to understand that violence happens across all these sectors. It's not just when someone takes a knife or a gun and shoots, but actually violence is experienced in terms of that definition. Right? Then we start to understand this cultural violence, social violence, economic violence. And only then, if we understand that, do we have a framework into which we can place the physical violence that people then get up to. All right. And that's a very short thing, but I've taken up lots of time. But definitely open for questions in a bit.
All right, so living in South Africa today, that's our topic. Looting, shooting, understanding South Africa a little bit better. And I want to thank Grant for just painting that picture. Actually, I've been working for Grant. He's a colleague and a friend, and I didn't know that he is so deeply rooted in violence. So I learned something new about my colleague today. And I'm running through the next slide. I'm going to introduce us to thinking about violence and unrest, looting and shooting in a slightly different way. Let me introduce you to understanding it firstly, from a trauma perspective. Okay? And if I had gone to an Oxford dictionary and just wanted to know what's the definition of violence, it would pick up physical harm, injury. If I picked up unrest, it would be disturbances, disruptive behavior, agitation, and then we're going to get to trauma. Because the three overlaps, it is highly, highly correlated, and they work together. So I'm first going to start off by all of us thinking a little bit about trauma. And then as we journey together in the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be able to put it all together. So if I ask everyone here what's trauma, I think a lot of people would say something that happened in their childhood, child abuse, or a rape case, or a crime that they witnessed. So it's often linked to a single event. Am I correct? If I ask what is trauma, more or less people would say it's a specific event. I want us to think of it in two different ways today. So the one is that specific event, which is what we call an individual trauma, where someone experiences something, and what are the reactions towards that particular experience. So what is my bodily, my psychological, my emotional, my biological reaction to that trauma? But I want to introduce you to something that you might not, some of you might know about it, but it's called collective trauma. And that's a slightly different term, different concept, and I want us as a congregation to start thinking about that. Collective trauma is where a group of people or a community, you could even take Pinelands or Pinelands Methodist Church, experience an event or something. Okay? So it's that shared experience by a group of people. And that's collective trauma. And often collective trauma is passed down from generation to generation. Sometimes if I just look out and I think about what's going on in our country quite a bit because it's in my face, in my practice, and child abuse, rape, poverty. It's daily, I can go out into my street, I stay in Athlone, grew up in Athlone. My grandmother's just passed away, she's 96. She's from Athlone, like all my generations are in Athlone. And so collective trauma is passed down from generation to generation. And I know the Bible speaks about generational karma, it often speaks about blessings, your children's children. So that's often something I ponder with. And there's something called epigenetics. I don't know if you've heard of the term or not. But epigenetics is, in the last decade or so, there's a scientific studies around biological genes that have context and the interplay and how that gets passed down. And trauma is massive. I look at the generation now and we can see that passing down of trauma from one generation to another generation. That's collective trauma. And that is a lot of what has taken place when violence erupts. And the looting and shooting incident is not a 2021 phenomenon. We can think back to many incidences where there were looting, unrest, UCT. I studied there and I know the whole fees must fall movement. There's lots of stuff going on. There are cycles and cycles and cycles of this. So what I want us to think of is this analogy, and I kind of did it in circles. So I want us to start thinking of collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, historical trauma. And I'm going to do it with an individual and then I'm going to do it with the collective. If we start with the shock and the trauma, we move into what we call a survival mode. And in our survival mode, the brain, our vagal nerve, not going to get into too much, we pick it up, we remember that. And we remember that incident. Even if it was a shared experience, we remember that. It's in our body. Trauma is in us. We physically engage with that. And we move into survival mode. And that explains why when there's a shooting in Hanover Park, the kids will go towards the body as opposed to moving away. Because if I witnessed the shooting, I'd go, let's go. If there's a riot or a protest, people move towards that. They participate. There's an agency that happens. And a lot of that is rooted of people living in that survival mode. Right? And if we reside in that survival mode for long periods of time, it's being passed down from generation to generation, we begin to disconnect. And what do we disconnect from? We disconnect from our thoughts, the inconsistent, the not coherent. We disconnect from our emotions, so we lack empathy. We lack compassion. We no longer know how to love our neighbor. So often in our encounter, why people so angry? Why can't we just connect? Why do you not even feel for the next person? Because people begin to disconnect. They disconnect emotionally, they disconnect physically. And then the reenactment happens again. And so it's easy for us to kind of pinpoint this in an individual, and we have that individual perhaps in a vacuum, and they go to therapy, you know. That's why I kind of step out of that therapy role and more into the community space, because we need to tackle it at more of a systemic level, and we need to see what's going on with groups of people so that we can have change and impact. All right? Let's go to the next slide, please, Lauren. So the minute we start to think about collective trauma as the basis to a lot of what happens with violence, with crime, with people disconnecting, lack of empathy, and the list is endless. So when I witnessed in June and July what was happening in our country, I took a step back, I observed it. Did I have anger initially? Yes. I was angry initially. And then I had to think about this. Because then it quickly dawned on me the underlying currents that we don't see that is built up, not only in KZN, but across South Africa. Our violence and crime statistics what? If I go into Statistics SA, heart bleeds for a number of crime stats. Our poverty stats were, when I started researching poverty about 10 years ago, it was 50.1. We're now up to almost 80%. So that's the rate at which things are going in our country. That's living in South Africa today. And I'm going to introduce you to what we call a trauma team. And it's such a beautiful way for us to understand, like Grant would say, context. What is visible? What is invisible? So that we can make sense of how do we engage, how do we as pioneers, Methodists, tackle some of these systemic things in our society. You know, as Christians, we're called to do this work, this hard work. Jesus walked a hard path. I love the Lord. He walked a hard path. You know, so we really need to start thinking about that. And the trauma tree is an analogy where the roots are everything that is unseen. Okay? So things such as mass incarceration, slavery, the genocide, apartheid could be there, the Holocaust, forced displacements. Okay? If you walked into any context now, maybe Athlone and Nova Park, Langa, Pinelands, and you encounter a young child and you ask them anything about what they're going to do, they don't know the roots of why they placed there, why they're in that particular context. These are invisible things, and these are the things we don't want to talk about, or we don't want to acknowledge, or we don't know how, or where to begin. But these invisible roots, now we know a tree stands because of its roots. So that tree will stand no matter what that roots, where it's been placed. And so we need to think about that. What are the roots of the people, perhaps in the looting and shooting? And it's a bit of a tricky one because there's political stuff and all sorts of other things going on there. But let's take it more generally to living in South Africa today. What are those roots? We need to start exposing those roots and we need to start discussing them. Then we have, closer to the top of the tree, we have things such as And I put poverty just above that because we can visibly see poverty now. But poverty, community violence, lack of educational opportunities, racism, discrimination, adverse community environments. So we begin to see that now. So it's hard for us not to acknowledge it because it's there. It's so beautiful that I get to stand in Highlands today because tomorrow we'll be just across the road in Nanga speaking about the trauma fee. You know, and it makes me always feel like I wish we could just bring everyone together and have like genuine discussion, you know, about how people feel, hard stuff, important stuff. And then we move up to the branches and the leaves. And these are the things that we see every day. Substance abuse, domestic violence, mental illness. Almost all of us have encountered that somehow, especially since 2020 hit, the amount of death and just all sorts of things. Neglect and so forth. Those are the branches and the leaves that we see. So those are the stuff on the top of the trees, and sometimes we deal with that. But not all the time, because it speaks to access. Do we have access to the facilities, access to opportunities, and so forth. But the trauma tree is a beautiful basis for a framework to understand violence, unrest, crime, and a lot of what is motivating people's behavior these days. It's all of these things. And that's why I love this analogy, because it really speaks about the roots as well as some of the visible stuff that we see. So I'm just going to take a minute before I move on. Like, I'd love to know your thoughts. Comments, thoughts. Speak freely.
So what I experience after the environment is I get asked, where do you work? And I say, I work for the city of Cape Town. And they say, well, okay. And what do you do with the city of Cape Town? So I say, I work directly under the mayor. Okay, what does the mayor do? So then I say, I'm working in the problem areas of the city of Cape Town. So what are the problem areas? So then I say, Alicia, Nyanga, Guletu, Hanover Park, Manenberg, Ocean View, Mecklenburg, and so on. And then they say to me, oh, those are the areas I don't know.
Yeah.
Shouldn't you be working somewhere else? Or, you know, that's the daily challenge I have.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, yeah, and thank you. Any other thoughts, feelings?
You know, when you look at the video clips of the 1968 riots in America, you look at the video clips also of the riots that took place in Britain about 8-9 years ago, and you look at the video clips of the violence that took place here about a year ago, they all lose complete control of their almost intellect, because they destroy their own benefits. You know, clinics and hospitals and libraries, everything gets destroyed. They look in them. So there's definitely a mental lock that they get into when they get into that certain situation, where they lose all concept of purpose of demonstration, put it that way. Do you agree?
Yes and no. I think I do understand, and that's the psychological thing, that's the brain, that's the nervous system, that's the memory, that's the trauma that the body holds. So there is a disconnect. And for that, I do agree. But you know, the hospital and the clinic and the school is the furthest thing on that person's mind. Because they won't be able to access a hospital or school if they don't have a meal at night. then those things become secondary. People they're hopeless. There's no self-dignity. They don't have food. So I'm not even going to access that park or that hospital or even that school. I would love to see that. I don't have meal to eat tonight. So it's a catch-22. Thank you so much for sharing.
Can I just add?
You may, and then we'll take another
I
comment.
think it's also worth adding, like, a number of years ago they did, there was a study done in the 2008, 2009, there was the xenophobic attacks and some violent service delivery protests, and there was a study done across a various number of communities, sort of northwest province, that area, to look at what was going on. And the title of the study ended up being The Smoke That Calls. And you can actually, the whole study is available online. The reason they called it that was they asked one community, is like, why do you burn things? Like what's the purpose of why? Because if we don't burn, no one comes. And so we need to understand that it's part of it, it's not the whole. Again, there is something around, only when I'm burning things do I get a response. And so we need to understand a lot of the behavior also within the context of a collective group who feel disempowered, neglected, and ignored, and how do I get your attention? And so those are things to also keep in our minds as we consider how they go about and the things that people do. But if you can just Google The Smoke That Calls, it's by the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And I do have it, so if you can't find it, you can get hold of me.
Thank you, Grant.
I think what you were talking about tonight reminded me of I was treating a patient from a Winnisburg community, and the burn patient, and he was struggling, and I said, did you take your pain meds today? And he said, no. And I said, why not? You knew this was going to hurt. And he said, because you told me I had to take it with food and I didn't have any.
That's the reality. Do you know how hard it is for me as a psychologist to go into counseling? And my HPCSA, fancy HPCSA, you're not allowed to feed your clients. Like you can't teach a hungry child, you can't feed a pig. I mean, you're OT. We can't do that without, and yet the regulators that we can't do that. I keep apples and I give tea. They can just find it. I'll lose the job, that's fine. But we have to do it. Yeah. Let's take another one or two more comments. It's so good to generate this kind of conversation. I'd like to hear. Yeah. Do you have do you have a comment? No. Anybody else? Thoughts, comments?
I didn't realise that there could be group trauma which was passed down. One hears of as you know, as you say, individual trauma. But group trauma, then it sort of suddenly starts to sort of make sense.
Mm.
Thank you. That's a powerful statement. Thank you. Because there's been a shift. And collective trauma is very popular in our country, in South Africa. And I love that Pioneers Methodist is doing this. Your leadership team is amazing for thinking about what is living in South Africa like today. And what's different here in our context as well is that we have this collective trauma, but we also have what we call continuous trauma. And it's not just, it's people in finance, it's all my friends that stay in finance too, because it's not just all of us. We're not just struggling with the corrupt government, but it's the corrupt government and the increasing inflation and the lack of safety and trains now being cut. This is us, finance. And I know, no one mentioned it in the finance, but a friend of mine just said there's a certain part of finance that you want to live in, and there's a cutoff which is closer to the somewhere that there's more crime. So if you look at the crime statistics in finance, there's a lovely clear divide, and I know that line exists in finance, that if you're closer to certain areas, you're more prone to your homes to be attacked. So these are not, what we're discussing here is not foreign, continuous trauma and collective trauma, which really is a good understanding to how we start engaging. And as much as what we're speaking about it, maybe with a bit of a hard or a sad heart, within all of that, there's opportunity for hope and restoration too. And I think next week or the next time we're here, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to start tapping into that. Okay, so now we know this, we've got this. What do we do? How do we shift? Yeah.
I think that's what adds to the trauma, is that you feel threatened, so you feel angry, you feel guilty because you're angry, you feel sort of traumatized because you don't know what to do about it. It's just everybody seems to be caught up in this violence, sort of circle of helplessness, of anger, of frustration, and it sort of starts to escalate. And then, of course, with the lockdown, you can't communicate. So that sort of exacerbates.
And let me tell you, this trauma thing is not for a currently disadvantaged community. This trauma thing, we all lived through it. Your ancestors, your generations before you, they've lived through this same trauma thing. So it's not to say that it's not here. You know what I mean? I'm sure all of you can sit and start thinking about how these things have impacted you or your families today. Mental health, substance abuse. Sure. I know finance has got an increase in substance abuse rate. There's a lot of couples in therapy. A lot of couples in finance in therapy. So it's something that we have to all think about. So, yes.
I think the one thing we haven't, I'm quite surprised it hasn't come up, is the whole issue of gangs. Because gangs become a place of belonging, a place of power, a place of authority. And I mean, we have Bokmakeri just across the canal.
Yeah.
And I mean, we have a double story that we sleep in, and we hear the gunshots just about every night. And you know the gangs are operating, and to live under that kind of trauma is just, yeah.
That's vicarious trauma that you experience.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just thinking of the people there living under.
There as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I served for 5 years. I looked after a church in Hanover Park. I mean, I used to come to church in the morning, and people used to be half asleep because they slept under their beds because the gangs were out operating.
100%. Yeah.
And you just realize, how do you minister into that context?
Big questions. Big questions. Big questions. It's not just the theological questions about where's God in hard times. You know, the stuff we all grapple with. It's tough. So I want us, can we think about that for next week, for 2 weeks' time? Can we think about how do we minister into this? What does ministry look like? I would love to have us think about that for a minute. Sorry, Ron, can you just move to the next slide, please? And I just took a bit out from a training we just did recently. The cycles of intergenerational collective trauma and the reenactment of trauma happens through cycles of violence and unrest. So we have this underlying collective trauma, which all of us have to some degree. And so it lives out in these cycles. How we cope and which of these strategies become long-term patterns is influenced by our environment. So that speaks directly to what Grant was speaking about, the context. If the environment continues to feel unsafe or oppressive, over time we start to see patterns of disconnection. They take roots in families as well as communities. We see how individuals and groups reenact trauma and perpetuate cycles of violence, and the trauma continues. So it's such a part, I mean, I'm so passionate about this, and this is why we do what we do. It's because we can see that we need a way out, and it's about disrupting those cycles, not only at a therapeutic level, speaking from my profession, but at a systemic level. at a church level, at a school level, at a finance community level. And I mean, I sat here and I'm inside from this community from a therapeutic perspective more than a residential. I never lived in finance, I lived in Athlone. But I'm listening to everything said here and I'm thinking, if only I could share in each of those areas my perspective of finance. Some of it is true, but there's so much other going on. These people hurt me. And so I just want to think passion. But what I want us to do is, we're going to end now because I want to respect and honor your time and our time commitment. But what I'd love for you to think about as you exit today is to think about your own trauma tree, which is your first candle, and the context. Your church context, your family context. Families are breaking down. Why? All those unresolved things. Homes are being torn apart, So I want you to think about your own trauma tree. I want you to think about your community. And I want you to think about how do we minister into that community. Into our community. If I put that, then I'm using it for they, that. Our community. Our community. Is that okay? A little bit of homework. Is that okay? All right. I'm gonna Grant, you can just end up with. I just want to say thank you so much for what I hope was a beautiful opportunity for us in a think tank to engage with stuff that are real about living in South Africa. I want to say thank you to each and every one who came out this evening. That's big. With COVID and curfews and all this. So thank you for that. I know Grant and I think your pastor and everyone, priest. What did we say, pastor or priest? Minister?
Caretaker is what he called himself.
So thanks. Grant, do you want to say anything?
Well, particularly, I think one of the last things I feel like I want to just add, one of the things that we need to keep in mind also in terms of when we think about this is the way the people that lead weaponize trauma. So they use the reality of trauma and the reality of people's pain and anger for their own ends. And that's part of the disruption that needs to happen, is that we need leaders that don't do that. Right? So the one psychologist we know speaks about leaders that are trauma carriers or peace carriers. And the ones who are trauma carriers will reenact trauma and will too often pull people in to reenact that trauma. Whereas peace carriers are leaders that are going to disrupt those narratives, those processes, and those systems. And so part of our thinking is how do we become disruptors? How do we become peace carriers? And part of that is about thinking about your trauma tree. Because part of it is like trauma sits in our bodies. And we can look at it and we have to deal with it. And as soon and 2 weeks time we'll unpack it a little bit more. All right. Where it's 9, so I want to just close off, but I'm happy to hang around if people just have any questions or stuff they want to engage with further. If that's all right. But I definitely want us to kind of just finish off. I'm aware of this, that this could be, I don't know how you're feeling in yourself. So just for a moment, I just want you to kind of sit comfortably, both feet on the ground. I would say close your eyes. Hopefully no one nods off now. Do you have blankets? But just as we come to close, I just want you to just become aware of where you are. So just for a moment, just become aware, where am I? Think about where you are, the building that you're in. And then become aware of where you're sitting. Just feel the chair, your bum on the chair, your back on the back of the pew, your feet on the ground. Just feel that feet on the ground. And as you sit there, also become aware of just the clothes that you're wearing. the feel of their clothes on your body, feel it touching your skin. And then I want you just to start from the top of your head and move all the way down through your body. I want you just to become alert and aware of where you're feeling tension or any tension or constriction in your body. Just go through there. Become aware of, alert it, even touch it if you want to, breathe into it, but just go all the way, scan through your body, just about becoming aware that's what you're sitting with right now. And as we close up, I just want you to take a couple of nice deep breaths. And as you take those deep breaths, just imagine that air going to the places of tension. That air is just moving there. And then push the air out. And then take another deep breath. And out. And then when you ready, you can lift your head and open your eyes. So it's important because a lot of stuff we're talking about can stir things in us. Stir tension, can stir things, whatever that could be. I don't know what might have stirred in you. And it's important that we don't take that into our sleep time, to actually allow that to out. So if you feel it's still there before you go to sleep, grab yourself a nice cup of tea or something and just do something that you find helps to ground you and before we end up going to sleep. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time and your interaction and your questions and your comments. We look forward to the further engagement in 2 weeks' time. It will be on Tuesday in 2 weeks' time. But look forward to having more of that. But feel free to come chat or now as we go.
Yes.